And welcome back. This is the second part of really the first session on studies in the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to talk about an outline. So I think it's good whenever you're studying any passage of scripture to make an outline. There are some challenges that come with this, especially when you're first studying the passage, but there's also a lot of benefits that come with it. So one of the things that happens when you have to make an outline for yourself is you have to actually think, how does this text work? What's being said? What are the main ideas? What's a sub point? What's a main point? And you have to think through it. And usually you have to summarize, what does these 5 verses mean? What is the main point of this paragraph or whatever? So outlines are super helpful in that. And they also give us a framework to retain the information we're learning, right? If we just have to remember a whole bunch of random verses in a row together, we're unlikely to remember it in that order in a long time. But if we see a logical flow and a pattern of some sort, it's easier to remember, right? That's why songs are easier to remember, because there's a pattern, a rhythm to it. And if we see that rhythm in the text, we can retain the information better. But not only this, and especially with Matthew, and especially in the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of times seeing the structure of how it's written actually informs us on the meaning. So a lot of times, like, we have a verse, right? You're the salt of the earth. And we're like, oh, what does it mean to be salt of the earth? And we get meaning directly from the words that are there in that sentence, right? But inherently, sometimes the way he positions things, the author would, or the way he might use an inclusio, which is bookends, and I'll talk about that later, it also shows us meaning and tells us, hey, here's what's really going on in this section. So we don't want to miss out on those literary devices that we can pick up when we make an outline, because they help us understand the text better so that we actually can live it out better. So I like outlines. One of the challenges with an outline, though, is that when you're initially to a text, you're not that familiar with it. So it's difficult to do. And so you have to take time. So for me, an outline is always an ongoing process. I am always refining it, restating things, and trying to do it. And so if you go through this course and you get the notes in class, you're going to see that sometimes my outlines, because I didn't update every page of the notes whenever the outline shows up, so sometimes they don't match. But that's because I'm constantly thinking through it and working through it and saying, what actually makes sense of this text better? So I like to use the outline as a growth tool, as a tool to help me grow in understanding the passage. I'm not dogmatic about my outline. If you have a better one, go for it. I mean, I think outlines, they're not necessarily right or wrong. I just think some might be more helpful or beneficial or better than others. And I'm always looking for how I can tweak it to be a little bit better and to be true to the text. I want to be true to the text. That's really my goal, so that I get out of it what the author intended. So here, we'll just go through this. So outline. So I'm going to give you a simple outline first, and then I'm going to give you a more detailed outline. So once again, we're dealing with Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So the intro, right, and we know this structure. I'm going to give you intro, body, conclusion, right? Like every typical essay that you have to write in school kind of deal. You got to have an intro. Intro tells us the main ideas. The body is going to give us more ideas about those main ideas. So the Beatitudes are like the main ideas, which the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is going to kind of revolve around in some sort of way. So Matthew 5, 3 to 10, the Beatitudes. The body is 5, 17 to 7, 12. Now, and I've labeled this having a righteousness that fulfills the law and the prophets. Now, I didn't just arbitrarily choose 5, 17 and 7, 12. They actually have a repeated phrase. It says the law and the prophets in 5:17 and then in 7:12. That becomes an inclusio. Now, every time you see a repeated phrase doesn't necessarily mean it's an inclusio or a bookend, right? You get law and the prophets here, you get law and the prophets again. I don't know if you can see my hands. It's not very good, but you get it, and it bookends everything in between. And what that means is everything in between those phrases is dealing with what does it mean like to fulfill the law and the prophets. And that's what we get in 5:17 and 7:12. The main theme of 5:17 to 7:12, and Jesus does different things in there, but the main idea is Jesus expressing to us, what does it look like to have a righteousness that's greater than the scribes and Pharisees, that actually truly fulfills the law and the prophets. That's what 5:17 to 7:12 looks like. That's the body and the majority of the content. Next, after that, in 7:13 to 29, we get 3 or 4, depending on how you divide it up, final warnings. Basically saying, Jesus is basically saying, it's super important you live out the Sermon on the Mount. Let me tell you, give you 3 or 4 examples, however you want to divide that, of why it's super important. And that's what the final warnings are, to motivate us to live out the Sermon on the Mount. So that's my really simple outline of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's how you could start out, right? And if you don't have outline, you can steal somebody else's outline. You can steal my outline and use it and then be like, does that actually make sense? Is that actually the best way to think about this? And then change it, really. It's only as good as if you actually are using it and thinking about it in that context. So when I read the Sermon on the Mount, this is kind of in my mind when I'm reading it. I'm thinking, how does this section relate to the rest of the Sermon on the Mount? And it helps me think deeper about the text. So there's the whole thing, the simple outline. But I have another outline. It's a little bit more detailed, right? And obviously, at some point, if you have your outline become so detailed that it's no longer an outline, it becomes a commentary on the text where you actually have more writing than the verses that are there. That's no longer an outline, right? That's a commentary. So we're looking for summative statements about portions of the text that help us understand it. Now, I kind of sometimes in my own outlines, and here's the first part, I go back and forth between two things, right? Sometimes you take like here, Matthew 5, 3-10. You could be very textually descriptive, as in the 8 Beatitudes. That doesn't really tell me what they are or how they function or what the point of them is, but it tells me what's in the text. I think it's probably better in outlined to not just give textual descriptions of what's there, but to say, what does it mean and what is the point? And so I say, hey, how I would phrase this in a sentence, what the Beatitudes are, they're the characteristics of the people of the kingdom. I think that's what's going on. He's laying out what are the characteristics of the people of the kingdom, and then he's going to build on that later. So that's what I've labeled it, right? And then the next section, Matthew 5, 11-20, I call the call to have true impact by embodying the kingdom values. Now, I built my outline off of other people, right? And then I've refined it and thought, I don't know if that's the best way I like to say that. And I've adjusted it. So I'm stealing from people, I'm modifying, I'm using it as my own. And that's how you do it, right? We all learn from somebody. So the call to have true impact by embodying the kingdom values. That's the section in the Sermon on the Mount about salt and light. The next section is verses, and you can see there's an overlap there. I went to 5:11-20, and now I'm jumping back a couple verses because I'm not quite sure. There's like overlap of numerous of times in the Sermon on the Mount. There's like a little bit of overlap where a section kind of relates to the section before and the section after. They're kind of like what I think of as literary hinges. They kind of help the author switch to the next thing he wants to talk about. And so they kind of have overlap in both. The preceding and the following section. So Matthew 5:17-7:12. And I already mentioned that. That's the body, right? That's the body of the text. And it has that inclusio or bookend that says law and the prophets in both of those verses. And just a quick summative statement about it is this is what greatness, because he says having a greater righteousness than the scribes and the Pharisees. That becomes the question. And 5:17-20. And he says, this is greatness by fulfilling the law and the prophets. That's how we become great in Jesus' eyes, that we would actually fulfill the law and the prophets, right? And then at the end, I already covered this in my simple outline, but final warnings and the significance of living out the Sermon on the Mount. That's what SOTM is in our lives. The Beatitudes will be tested, right? And this is where I'm starting to turn more into commentary than outline, but it's a tough line. You get to do what you want. It's your outline. You can do what you want. All right, but now let's go back to 5:17-7:12, and let's break it down a little more. Matthew 5:17-20 is the call to greatness, and I struggle with that one, but that's what I've landed on for now. It'll probably change it at some point. But basically, Jesus is calling us to be great in his eyes, and he's going to show us how that looks like afterwards. All right, Matthew 5:21-48. Jesus is going to lay out 6 hindrances we must resist, or they will destroy the kingdom values being formed in our lives. A couple points here. I didn't write 6 hindrances, but there are 6, and it's clear in the text because Jesus, there's a repeated formula, like with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the blah blah blah, for they will blah blah blah, and we see that repeated, and we're like, oh, okay, that's a grouping. Well, we get that again in 5:21-48. It says, Jesus says, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. And he does that numerous times. Like, oh, this is a grouping. He's doing some kind of similar teaching in all of these. So I'm going to group them together and then think, what is he doing here? How does this relate to the rest of the text? And this is what I've come up with, that there's 6 things Jesus wants us to resist or not do, or they're going to destroy the kingdom values. Now, I've tied in kingdom values here with what I've called the Beatitudes. I said that's the characteristics, or those are the kingdom values that Jesus establishes, that what his people look like. The people of the kingdom have these values. And it says these are the ones that, these things, if you don't check them, they will destroy this, such as divorce, adultery of the heart, not being honest, hating your enemies, demanding justice. So that's that section. The next section, once again, there's a literary cue that I've used in the text to help me divide it up. And Jesus says, when you give, when you pray, when you fast. And I've used that to help me divide up this section, say, okay, something similar is going on here in these three things. And I've labeled it, it's Matthew 6, 1-18, positioning our hearts to receive grace to live the kingdom values. So it's a way in which we access grace from God to be able to live the way he wants us to live. So we start giving our money away. We start praying. We enter into fasting. We receive help from God to actually have those values come alive in our heart and to live out the Sermon on the Mount. So it's ways we access grace from God to live it out. Matthew 6, 1-18. The next section, Matthew 6, 19-34. This is trickier. I put a lot of thought into this, and I'm not quite satisfied with what I have, but it's where I'm at right now, and it makes sense to me, and I've thought about it a lot. I think Matthew 6, 19-34, it's wholehearted pursuit of the kingdom values without distraction. I think Jesus addresses a couple of issues, whether it be money, fear, anxiety, and he's teaching us to seek his kingdom, those kingdom values, wholeheartedly, and not being distracted by the things that the world tells us we need or are important. And so I think that's the main gist of what's going on there, with lots of details that we want to get into, but main idea. 7, 1-12, Matthew 7, 1-12. This is the section where judging comes up, and asking, seeking, and knocking. And in this, I've labeled it remaining humble in pursuit of the kingdom values, because I think that's actually the main idea with his address on judging, is that he's saying, hey, when you begin to pursue these kingdom values, right, you're trying to live out the Sermon on the Mount. You're asking the Holy Spirit to form the Beatitudes in your life. And he says, wait a minute, when you start to look at others who aren't doing this, don't you become judgy. Don't you work on yourself. Remember, you have a log in your own eye before you pick out that speck. So he says, remain humble in the pursuit of kingdom values. If you do this the right way, you're not going to be so focused on everybody else's flaws. You're going to see your own flaws first. So I think he gives us some helpful ways to walk this out, walk out the Sermon on the Mount, these kingdom values amongst other people. So, and that main idea is humility. And so finally, when you see the whole thing, that's it. So that's my outline on the Sermon on the Mount. If you're in this class, right, you're going to have to memorize this because it will be on a quiz and a test. So you want to learn this, but do your own. I want you guys to work on your own, adjust the language, think about it, understand what's in the text in each portion, and get familiar with it, and you'll help understand the Sermon on the Mount better. It'll give meaning to it. All right, that's it. Thanks, guys. Till next time. I'll see you later.